welcome. If you're one of my subscribers, thank you. If you are new to my channel, my name is Deb. I recently moved to New Zealand with my husband John from the United States. Today I want to share about what our experience was renting a property in New Zealand as Americans. I'm going to share some of the differences that we noticed about rental properties and about the process of renting a property here in New Zealand. And then I'm going to share about 2 questions that me and my husband wished we'd have asked on the first lease that we'd signed here in New Zealand. 2 questions that we are definitely taking forward with us on any other rental properties that we would take a look at in the future. Our first rental property ended up being our biggest headache in the entire process. It's definitely a headache I would love to spare someone else from having. So let's go. So I want to share about mine and my husband's first experience signing a lease in New Zealand, because we made a big mistake initially and it turned into a lot of headache and stress and a very expensive lesson to learn that we did not budget for on our journey here. From job offer and hooray, we're going to New Zealand, to feet on shore in New Zealand, we had a 6-week time frame. We started looking for a rental property while we were still in the US. We joined groups, and I talk about that in a different video, which I can link here. And we'd ask them, like, where do you even begin looking for a rental in New Zealand? And they said, Trade Me. So we got on Trade Me and we started looking at properties, basically to try and get an idea of what sort of a budget we would need for renting, and then what sorts of properties can we expect to be able to afford. Something to know is that you're not able to set up an account on Trade Me unless you live in New Zealand or Australia. There's something around not being able to set up an account while you're still in the United States. So that makes it hard to communicate with questions that you might have on properties, or if you want to communicate with a property manager to set up a booking, you're not able to do that without an account on Trade Me. So what my husband did was he emailed Trade Me and explained the situation, that we were going to be moving to New Zealand and we had questions around properties and wanted to communicate with the property managers, and Trade Me did allow us to set up a account while we were still in the US so that we could start doing that. So hopefully if you're in that situation, they'll let you do the same thing. So something we noticed right away is that on Trade Me, the rental prices are listed per week. And in the States, of course, we're used to it being listed monthly. So when I first saw that, I thought it was a typo. Something to know about Auckland is that it's quite expensive to rent here. Now, Austin is the same way, so it wasn't as much sticker shock for John and I as it might be for somebody coming from a city that has a lower cost of living than Austin, or maybe not coming from a city at all and just coming from a more rural area in the United States. It's going to be a much bigger sticker shock for somebody like that than it was for us. So just something to be aware of. So that's the first thing, is that it's expensive and the rent is paid weekly instead of monthly. Next, in America, we're used to, if you're going to rent a property, the majority of time it's going to have a refrigerator as just part of the rental. But here, big appliances like that don't necessarily come with the rental and aren't necessarily worked into the rental price. So it's just something to be aware of, and something to know that if it doesn't say refrigerator under furnishings, for instance, there might not be a refrigerator in the rental unless you buy one yourself. And that's something that you can sometimes negotiate. We did negotiate on our first rental that they put a refrigerator in the property as part of the rental agreement, because initially he was going to have it without the refrigerator. And the same goes for dishwasher, microwave, washer, dryer, just any of those big appliances. Just be sure that if you're not planning to buy one and you want one in your rental, that you ask about that. And that brings me to negotiations too, because like we had negotiated that with our first rental property. We didn't know when we first started looking at rentals, can you negotiate, or is that considered rude here? We didn't want to be rude, so we talked to a few property managers about that, and they told us that there is sometimes a 5 to 10% range for negotiation on the rental price. Now, a proviso with that is not all landlords will want to negotiate. And secondly, sometimes if you negotiate, you might end up not being the tenants that the landlord selects. Because how it works is you put in an offer, and if there's several offers in on the property, the landlord will choose which one suits them best. And if you are negotiating with that 10% discount and somebody else isn't, the landlord's probably going to go with them. That actually happened to John and I on our first offer that we made here. We negotiated that 10%. We're like, oh yeah, we're going to get this, because the property manager even thought that the landlord would probably accept that, but the landlord ended up going with a different offer instead. So just something to be aware of is that if you are going to negotiate, you are risking potentially losing out on being the selected offer. But we were told, like, don't try to negotiate like 20-30% off of the rental price, because that could be considered rude. And even if you make that offer to the property manager, that the property manager might not want to work with you either. So next, there isn't a lot of the central heating and air, at least not on any of the properties that we went out to see when we were looking at a rental. And we talked to property managers as well, and they said that central heating and air, that there just isn't a lot in New Zealand overall. What they use instead is a heat pump. And a heat pump is basically like either a floor or a wall unit that is in the main living space typically, and it's meant to heat that area. If it heats the rest of the home, then you're that much better off, but it might not necessarily. And so what they would normally say is like, oh, well, you just open up the windows if it's too hot, or else you can get space heaters if it's too cold. Some properties have wall unit heaters where it's kind of like a space heater, only it's attached to the wall. So those are some of the ways for temperature control. And one of the things that we're told is that it's a very temperate climate here in Auckland, so they don't necessarily need a lot of like cooling, because they just open up their windows. And now that we've come to the windows, I want to talk about screens, because that was a huge one for me that kind of bugged me out, that there aren't screens on the windows, or like no screened in doors on the glass sliding doors. So you just have all that, any bugs, insects that want to fly in. But apparently it's not an issue here, is what everyone's telling me. Is like, maybe you'll get the occasional house fly, but I'm from the South in the United States, so it can be quite buggy there. And so having the windows just left open, or the doors without any screens, that probably wouldn't be something I would do coming from the South in the United States. But here in New Zealand, apparently it is okay, and it just doesn't get that buggy. So I'm looking forward to that. Next, bond. When you see bond in the post for a property on Trade Me, it's their security deposit. How it works here is you pay it to the landlord or the property manager, and then they file it with the government. And then the government, at the end of your lease, sends it back into your NZ bank account. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And if you don't know about setting up an NZ bank account, me and my husband also did a video on that, so I can link that. Those were some of the differences that we noticed with renting a property here in New Zealand. And now I want to share with you what mine and my husband's first rental experience was here in New Zealand, because that actually turned out to be one of the biggest headaches and stressors that we had in this entire process of moving to New Zealand. And there were two questions that we learned to ask after our first rental situation that we will carry forward into any other rental situation that we're in. Like I mentioned before, we didn't have a lot of time to look into the rules and the laws, and this is why I wish we had, because we looked at various properties, and then we saw this property that had big, beautiful windows on both the upstairs and the downstairs. It had a very modern looking build to it, and it reminded us of our place in Austin, so it kind of felt like home when we went in to see it. Well, we signed the lease, and we moved in a week later. We slept there for 2 nights, and by slept, I mean we were pretty much awake the whole night, clearing our throats and just trying to breathe in there, because the master bedroom was quite musky. Now, initially we thought, well, we'll just open up some of these big, beautiful windows and it'll air it out, which it helped a little bit when we opened up the windows, but then this was the beginning of August. It was quite rainy and cold. So we didn't have the windows open very much because we didn't want to let the water in. and the wind was really strong. You could almost feel it through the windows. They were not double glazed windows, which is another thing we found that is really important for us to have. I was putting away clothes on that second day there, and I noticed on the back of one of the drawers this little furry, like black, and I thought it was a caterpillar initially. That's how thick it was. And I wiped it off and I realized, of course, it's not. It's either a mildew or mold or something. And I was like, okay, well, at least I could clean that off. But then I saw where the TV would go. There was a hole for the TV cords, and you could see behind the built-in, the wall had like this black splotchy fuzziness on it, and the cord coming out as a white cord had this black on it as well. So at that point we felt we were dealing with a mold situation that could be affecting our health the longer we were there. So we decided we were going to call the landlord, and we talked to him about our concern about mold, and he did work with us. We had a 6-month lease and he shortened it. We were still paying on that though while we were moved into an Airbnb, because we just didn't want to stay there anymore. It was like, we felt like at that point it was going to be a health concern. We didn't want to have to deal with our health on top of everything. The only furniture we had bought at that point was the queen bed, and we ended up even just leaving that because it also smelled like that. We had our clothes that had been hanging in the closet. We had those, which is the majority of our clothes, picked up by a laundromat and cleaned. So it seemed like expense after expense in that situation, and it was a big headache that I would love to spare you. So if you have not looked into healthy homes in New Zealand, please do that before you rent a property. Something else we learned after that first situation is that the landlord is supposed to be providing you with a healthy home statement along with the lease. We didn't get that from the first landlord. Now, he was not a property manager. He was just a private individual renting out his place, so he probably just didn't even know that he needed to give that to us. But if you're renting a property, make sure that you get that from the landlord or property manager. So the two questions that we asked after that first situation, and we'll ask moving forward, are: one, is it Healthy Homes compliant? Because apparently they have 90 days from the time you rent it to make it that way, if it's not already. So that's 90 days that you might be paying and not be living in a Healthy Homes compliant situation. If that matters to you, it's a good question to ask. Is it currently Healthy Homes compliant? The second question is, are there any exemptions? Because apparently healthy homes can also have exemptions where a property is considered healthy home compliant, but it might not necessarily meet all of the healthy home requirements because it's got an exemption. So how they get an exemption, that type of thing, I am not really sure how that piece of it works, but you can look into it. It was just something that me and my husband learned to ask, because we did not want to rent a place that had any exemptions. We wanted to be fully Healthy Homes compliant and with no exemptions. So that's what we were asking. Is it currently Healthy Homes compliant, and does it have any exemptions? And if it had any exemptions, we took a pass. We did go out to see a property where it was in an apartment complex, and the property manager said, oh, well, it's an end unit, so it's Healthy Home compliant, but has an exemption. Even though a property manager might be the property manager on a property, it doesn't mean they carry that around in their head. So I would definitely make sure to ask them, and if they don't know, they can find out. So it's definitely something they can find out if they don't know right off. And something else I want to say is that the property managers that we had helping us were very honest about things. So when you ask them, they do find out for you if they don't know, or they try to educate you about things as much as possible. At least that's been our experience. Even going out to see a property and we're like, oh, we love this property, it's so great. The property manager was like, well, I just told, so that you know, it does get quite loud back here on the weekends because it was near a nightclub, and just letting you know that. So we got a lot of good information from property managers like that. Our experience has been that they're very honest. We did end up renting a non-furnished apartment that we had to furnish, but one of the reasons we did is because we ended up having a much harder time than we thought finding a property that was close enough to where we needed it to be to John's work. I was fully Healthy Homes compliant, and that of course became very important to us after our first situation. So we do love it here. At some point I'll do a tour of it so you can kind of see, and I'll talk about where we got furniture for it. If you have any experience around rentals, any tips that you want to share, please drop it in the comments below so we can all continue to learn and grow together. If you found this video helpful, please feel free to comment, like, and subscribe for more on our adventures. Cheers until next time.